Sanji has cock, or does he? That is the current debate the One Piece world is embroiled in after the events of chapter 1152. Well, technically, this debate has been a thing since all the way back in Wano, when Kaido flat out told Zoro that he himself also had cock, just like his captain. To which a very tired and injured Zoro then responded with, "Bruh, I have no idea what you're on about," before passing out and forgetting the whole conversation. Which, by the way, quick side note, the fact that Zoro didn't know he had this ability really hurt my theory that he was using his fight with Lucci as a way to train his use of this Haki. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still personally think that he was using the Catman as a way to train, because very clearly he was not taking that fight seriously, but since he wouldn't officially realize he had it until like 30 chapters into the following arc, it means he wasn't training that specific skill. What skill was he training? I don't know. As of right now, my current theory is that maybe Enma was still being a bit rebellious, so he was trying to tame it a bit more before he got into his next serious fight, which very obviously he did not consider Lucci to be one. But the point is that the moment Kaido announced to the world that our favorite resorted pirate was also a conqueror, a spark was ignited that incited a war between the Zoro and Sanji fans. One side of the fandom deducing that the other wing of the future Pirate King would very likely reach the same height, since throughout the entire story, they were usually kept relatively close in power, while the other side took advantage of their newfound superiority over the former and used it to continuously downplay Sanji's importance to both the crew and story as a whole. There's also a third, more quiet group in this whole debate that is more down the middle with their stance, just letting the story develop as it is, not really too invested in Sanji showcasing his cock, but would be perfectly fine with seeing it if he does. Which, if I'm being honest, this is probably the stance we should all take when reading One Piece, since no matter what we personally believe, the story is ultimately out of our hands. We are completely at the whims of Oda and what direction he decides to take the characters in, no matter if we agree with it or not. But that being said, this wouldn't be a true shonen fandom if we didn't spend hours upon hours furiously debating and power scaling our favorite characters against one another. And now, thanks to chapter 1152, that debate has reached a whole new height, with Scopper once again telling Zoro that he is able to use Conqueror's Haki, but this time he actually listened. Especially since Luffy also confirmed it in the following panel, and he was actually kinda annoyed that Zoro didn't already realize this. All while sadly, Sanji hoping for the same recognition, asked Scopper if he was also a conqueror, only to be left on red. And Scopper did that to him face to face, which is really hard to do. I know, I've tried. But unlike Scopper, I'm not a conqueror, so I didn't have the will to see it through. And I think it goes without saying that the Zoro fanboys took this scene and ran with it, shouting to the heavens that the cook would never cook again. But you see, here's the thing. Despite what some may say, this chapter doesn't necessarily mean that Sanji won't also unlock the power. Because really, there's two ways that you can read the section of the chapter where Scopper mentions someone besides Luffy being a conqueror. In fact, whether or not you include Luffy in the topic, it's part of how you can interpret it in a different way. One way is the obvious, and I feel like the initial way those who read the fan translation interpreted this section, with Scopper saying that aside from Luffy, there is another person on the crew that can use this Haki. And based on that interpretation, logic would obviously point towards him meaning Zoro, since we already had confirmation from another conqueror that he also was one. But the other way you can interpret this scene, and what I think is more in line with how the official translation is presenting it, is that when Scopper says that there is more than one person who can use color of the Supreme King, he is specifically referring to both Zoro and Sanji. As in, he was already aware that Zoro had the ability and is learning for the first time now that Sanji does as well. Now, here's the thing. Both interpretations are very likely, but I will say that I personally lean more in favor of the latter over the former, due to this being the second time Scopper has met Zoro. The first being the very brief skirmish the former pirate had with Luffy, where Zoro was forced to jump in to protect his captain, and the two were ready to tag team against the old man. And if you go back to that fight in chapter 1140, you can see a streak of black lightning in the panel where the two get ready to fight. Could be Conqueror's Haki, could not be, could be come from Luffy or Zoro, we don't know. But regardless, if Scopper is able to sense whether or not someone can use it, then this would have been when he figured out that these two had that power. So him being surprised to find out that the crew had another conqueror in chapter 1152 when only Zoro and Sanji were in that panel wouldn't make much sense if it was Zoro that he was referring to. Though, to be fair, it could be that he was so focused in on Luffy's cock that he failed to notice Zoro unknowingly flexing his own right in front of him. But if I'm being honest, I don't think that's likely, at least not for a Haki vet like him, he definitely would have taken notice of both their cocks being right in his face. So realistically, it has to be Sanji that he's referring to in this panel because this is the two's first time meeting, which means it will be the only chance he had to sense it from him. Plus, like many others have already pointed out, the conversation the two had in the background of Haruden and Loki's argument is very telling. Because if Oda had already decided that Sanji was not going to be a conqueror, he would have just had Scopper deny it then and there, making a gag out of it similar to how he did when Sanji discovered his new bounty, and realized his spot as number 3 on the crew was taken over by Jinbei, making him now number 4. But it's left pretty ambiguous, so at the very least, the idea is still a possibility in Oda's mind. And look, there is a very strong story reason why it would make sense for Oda to make Sanji a conqueror. One we'll get into a bit later in the video, but it is a fair question to ask if outside of that reason, does he have the qualities needed to be one? And in order to answer that, we first have to figure out exactly what are those qualities. And look, this is going to be a slightly controversial statement, one that I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for, but strength has nothing to do with being a conqueror. It's a nice plus to be strong on top of having this power, but it's not a requirement. It's why I never wrote off the possibility of a major character like Teach joining that exclusive club, because while he may not be a traditionally strong character, definitely not in the same ranks as someone like Shanks, he does exhibit the real qualities a conqueror should have. According to the One Piece Wiki, Supreme King Haki is proof of an individual who possesses the qualities of a king, a candidate chosen by heaven. This can outright manifest in an ambition to become a king of some kind. However, Supreme King Haki users need not have been born of royal bloodline, nor does it require one to strive to become royalty in the literal sense. It only needs one to have the greatest ambitions, such as Luffy becoming the next king of the pirates, Zoro becoming the most skilled swordsman, even Blackbeard becoming king of the world. However, two things that they don't mention in the wiki that is very prevalent in the story is that they all have tremendous willpower, willing to pursue their own goals and ambitions despite the world telling them it's impossible, even at the cost of their own lives. With the only time they will willingly give up their goals is to protect someone or something they deem as more important. And that each and every conqueror that we come across in the story so far have all been very capable leaders, even including Kid. So, those are the 4 traits that every conqueror we've seen throughout the story share, and leaving aside the first one because the only way to prove that you were born with the power is by showing that you have it, I would argue that Sanji fits all of the remaining 3. First off, being a leader, Sanji has multiple times, especially post the time skip, taken over leading parts of the crew when Luffy has been absent. He's definitely seen as like the 3rd in command, maybe even the 2nd in command, considering it's even more rare for Zoro to take on a leadership role, since usually he's missing alongside Luffy. In fact, now that I think about it, I think Nami might have led the crew more times than Zoro did, with the only time I could think of him leading it being during the Oars fight. So yeah, leadership qualities, check. Great ambition, Sanji by far has the hardest goal amongst the entire crew, finding the All Blue, a place that connects all 4 seas together and contains every single type of fish. Something that based on the current make of the world, is just physically impossible to even exist. Zoro can train hard enough to one day surpass Mihawk, Nami can sail across the entire world, drawing a map documenting her journey, Brook literally just has to turn around and he will find Laboon, but short of something destroying the entire Red Line, Sanji should never be able to reach his dream. And yet, despite how impossible it may be, he is as sure that he will find it one day as Luffy is that he'll become king of the pirates. Nothing will deter this man from seeking out his goal until he either achieves it or dies trying. So when it comes to the ambition requirement of becoming a conqueror, I think we can pretty safely also check that off his list. And then finally, there's willpower, again, something that we can easily check off. I mean, for starters, his original backstory alone shows how much of that he has. It's got to take a lot of will to survive that long, stranded on a rock in the middle of the ocean. Sure, he had food and water, even more than he should have thanks to Zeph giving him his share too, but keep in mind, that only lasted for 25 days. Once that ran out and all the two had left was that sack of gold, he still had to tough it out for 2 whole months. But hey, I've seen others write that off as not being anything impressive. I mean, 19-year-old Zoro was tied to a post for half that time and he was fine. So yeah, okay, fair enough. Then let's take a look at his real backstory. As a kid, Sanji was constantly beaten by his brothers, often left crying on the floor, begging for help from a father that was very emotionally and possibly physically abusive towards him, all because he took more of an interest in cooking than he did training. I mean, sure, Sanji was weak compared to his siblings due to not being born with their enhancements, but had he given up cooking and instead worked harder towards his training, Judge might at the very least have acknowledged his effort, maybe even had the others ease up on bullying him. But despite how much easier his life might have been if he had just fallen in line, no matter how much pain he had to endure on a daily basis, he refused to give it up, all because his mom loved his cooking. Up until the day she died, seeing Sora smile while eating the food he made was Sanji's goal. No matter what the others would do to him, he was willing to suffer through all that pain to make sure she was happy. And even after Sora's death and being locked away by his father, his love of cooking only grew stronger. In fact, it was during all this where he found his new dream of finding the All Blue, and he has been chasing after it ever since. If that is not tremendous will, then I don't know what is. So yeah, we can pretty much check that one off as well, which means those are all three core qualities of a conqueror, and Sanji has proven to embody each and every one of them. But that being said, there is one more thing. A moment where, when I look back to it, proved that Sanji had the makings of a conqueror. And that is going all the way back to chapter 367, where Sanji gets the okay from Luffy to try and rescue Robin. Because keep in mind, he just got a rundown from Nami about what happened, he knows exactly how strong CP9 is, and that is not likely that he could beat them by himself. And yet, regardless of if Frankie and Usopp were going to help, he still planned to take them all on to rescue a member of his crew. Now that being said, his attempt was obviously doomed to fail regardless, because even if somehow he managed to beat all of the guys who so easily defeated Luffy and Zoro, once he got to Khalifa, his code of not fighting women would have gotten him thrown right off the train. But still, in that moment, Sanji made a choice that both Luffy and Zoro would have made in the exact same position. Nami, Chopper, and Usopp, they would have waited for the rest of the crew to catch up, trying their best to gather info from the shadows, and only engaging in combat if they happened to be discovered. But these three, without question, 10 times out of 10, would always choose to take on the entirety of the train alone, Lucci and all, to try and save Robin from sacrificing herself. I say try because no matter what, all three would have failed in their initial attempt, but even if there was a 99% chance that they would lose, that 1% chance of success would be more than enough for them to bet their lives on. To me, that screams the heart of a conqueror. And it's not just that moment. Sanji has many more throughout the entire story that gives me that same exact feeling. Like in his introduction, choosing to feed a starving pirate despite his boss's objections, showing that he has a code that he lives by, to feed the hungry no matter who they are. And no matter what the consequences may be, he would never deter from it. Or when he willingly took a beating from his brothers, despite possibly being stronger than them by now, in order to protect Zeph. I know some are going to see that as a weakness and say that a real conqueror would have still fought back, but I remind you that when Boa presented Luffy with the choice of helping him fight his crew, or freeing Marguerite, Sweet Pea, and Apollondra, despite knowing that it means that he would never leave the island, he didn't hesitate to choose the latter. So it's not exactly out of question for a conqueror to choose to help others they're indebted to over their own wants and needs. Not to mention, there's also the fact that he did something that seemed to be impossible, kicking a beam of light, something that even Kizaru thought could never be done. Something that we thought throughout the entirety of Egghead, in order for Luffy to even do in Gear 5, he would need the gloves that Atlas used that let her touch light in the beginning of the arc. And look, there's many more examples of Sanji showing that he has the same qualities that we've seen from his fellow members of the Monster Trio that make them conquerors. Not even getting into the big moment with Kuma, where if not for a sneak shot from Zoro, he would have willingly made the same choice for his captain. But at the end of the day, even without all that, there's still one glaring reason why Sanji will have to become a conqueror, and that is because the story requires it. We have reached a point in the series where they are no longer just facing other strong pirates or marines with powers that a bit of stretchy punching can overcome. They are in the big leagues now, facing off against enemies and threats that have powers that just simply break the rules of the world, like being able to flip the morality of people with strong wills and good hearts to becoming demonic versions of themselves, and people who, despite having literal nukes shot in their face, can recover in seconds. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. What they're facing right now on Elbaf is only going to get worse going forward, with the remaining God Knights, 5 Elders, and even with themselves having even greater power. Power that, as of right now, the only thing we've seen being able to counter it is Conqueror's Haki. Which means that for Sanji to stay within the top 3 on the crew in terms of who gets the big one-on-one fights each arc, he's going to need to become a conqueror in order to keep up. So yeah, it's not that hard to guess that before we reach the end of Elbaf, he would awaken to this ability, especially if he ends up fighting one of the 2 remaining God Knights, which, as of this moment, is very likely. And Oda's already placed the pieces for his awakening at our feet, with the introduction to his counterpart on the Roger Pirates, Scopper Gaban, and the possibility of the power of love being a legit form once CoC can take. We just need to put them together. Now, admittedly, I could be wrong. This does all predicate on the idea that Oda intends to keep Sanji's status as part of the monster trio intact, but with the introduction to the idea that Loki could end up joining the crew, Sanji's spot is even more in danger now than it was when Jinbei joined. And even if he does end up staying as one of the top three, there's still the Chopper factor. Where it was kind of hinted that Drew studying Gabon's Haki, Chopper has the possibility of developing something that allows Sanji to negate the healing abilities of the God Knights without being a conqueror. Though the likelihood of that being the direction the story is going in is about as likely as Carrot joining the crew at this point, which not entirely impossible, but the odds are not in its favor. And look, I don't think Oda would have wasted over 1,000 chapters of the manga keeping Sanji as one of the 3 heavy hitters on the crew, only to have him fall so far behind the other 2 that he needs performance enhancers in order to keep up. Maybe his will be a bit different, we might not ever see him split the sky, but based on his journey so far throughout the story, Sanji has without a doubt, just like Luffy and Zoro, earned the right to be called a conqueror. And I, for one, am looking forward to the moment later in this arc when he awakens this ability and finally gets to showcase his cock for the world to see.